KS 2, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, this is Sreekumar. Left land, swim west, copy. Sreekumar. Crossing 21. Crossing at 24 is
Hello and welcome to the Blueskies podcast. I'm PR Ganapathy, your host.
Just 70, roger, report type southeast, connection, 4, the midway, and view selected.
Today I have a very different, unique, but extremely interesting guest, KS Sreekumar Nair. Sree is an old friend. He is, well, Sree, would it be correct to describe you as a historian of the Air Force? Sree wrote a book called The Forgotten Few, which really tells the story of the Indian Air Force from the very early days, long before an Air Force was even formed in the subcontinent, right up to the formation of independent India's Air Force. And today we're going to talk to him about the history of the Indian Air Force. We're just going to learn more about these initial stalwarts who went for training, saw action, and really represented the leadership of our Indian Air Force in the first few years. But first things first, welcome to the program, Sree.
Thank you so much, Guns, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm not a professional historian, I have to say, but my writings on the history of the Indian Air Force, particularly, have been quite well received. So thank you to everyone who's sort of given me a thumbs up.
Yeah, no, I've read the book and I've listened to some of your talks, and I think you've definitely spent a lot of time with historical materials and learned a lot about that history and put it together in an eminently readable form. So, but first things first, I like to know all my guests. What got you interested in this? Do you have an Air Force connection? And what was that? What is that process of coming up to speed on some of these things? What are the sources that you used?
Yeah, I do indeed have an Air Force connection, Guns. My father was in the Air Force, like yours, and served for nearly 40 years before we lost him. And he wasn't a pilot, but he had over 1,000 hours flying time. He was one of the predecessors of the role that we now call the flight test engineer, the flight test instrumentation engineer, actually. And he trained for that role in the UK. And so, as I say, he has over 1,000 hours flying time. And my father-in-law, who is a flight signaler, has nearly 3,000 hours flying time. So between them, my father and my father-in-law have 4,000 hours flying time, which is respectable. so,
And which aircraft were these on?
my father was, my father went around to many different types of aircraft. Wherever there was a seat that an instrumentation engineer could be put into. His first posting in the Air Force was actually as the electrical officer of 6th Squadron, which was at that time flying Liberators. So the Liberators were huge aircraft, so there was no problem about putting an additional person on board. And but then in his instrument when he did his instrumentation course, when he came back, he actually flew anything that was a two-seat that had a second seat. So he flew in the second seat of Harvards, Vampires, and everything up to a MiG-21. I think he never did get into the Jaguar was the last type that was inducted while he was in service. He never did fly in a Jaguar. I think he always regretted that a little. So.
Wow. And And your father-in-law was a flight signaler, you said. What was that role? Is it kind of like the radio operator type of a role?
That is indeed the radio operator role. He was a My father-in-law was like my father. Both were qualified engineers, and my father-in-law came from Gindi, which is in those days was a very prestigious engineering college. And he also spent his first posting. And he went to AFTC as my he went to what was then TTC, Technical Training College, which is now AFTC, Air Force Technical College. And
That's in
in
Jalahali, the one
Chalahally,
in
in
Bangalore.
Bangalore, and they were one course apart there. And my father-in-law's first posting was also a ground role, but it was in Ambala, which at that time was sort of the mecca of the Indian Air Force. Still is in some ways, I guess. And he volunteered as soon as applications were invited for technical officers to volunteer for aircrew duties. He put his hand up, and he was selected quite quickly. One of his course mates was selected for pilot training. He went for flight signaler training. And from that point onwards, he stuck with flying roles as long as he could, up to the rank of squadron leader. And he served as flight signaler primarily in. He also served in 6th Squadron. Then he went to 11th Squadron, which was a Dakota squadron at that time. And he's also done some. He's done a few odd sorties in aircraft that were being evaluated, particularly for the maritime reconnaissance role, such as the Shackleton. He's actually done 2 sorties in a Shackleton. So,
Wow.
so
Amazing, amazing.
interesting stuff, definitely. So,
Super. And so, it's not difficult to guess why you got interested in these things, but um, never thought of joining the service yourself?
I have an eyesight problem, Guns. So I would never have qualified for aircrew duties, and I was generally an unhealthy kid. I was a bit of a nerd. I was an unhealthy kid, and I actually finished school underage for the NDA. And and then I happened to qualify for an engineering college myself, and went off to college. And towards the end of my first year, I sort of looked up and looked around and said, "Do you think I could sit for the NDA again?" And in those days, this was between, I think, the third and the fourth pay commission. So in those days, when I asked that question, I think everyone around me in 4 different languages said, "Are you nuts?" or words to that effect.
Right, right. Great. Super. So you went off and, had a corporate career, but I presume you kind of kept scratching this itch and nursing this love of
I did,
aircraft.
and I think that is something I find that dozens of us guns, people like you and me, who didn't who maybe we came of age at a time when services careers have varied in India. They fluctuated in the sort of conventional attractiveness to young men and nowadays young women. I think today, in many conventional ways, they're quite attractive, but there have definitely been times in the past when they weren't. Right? So, but many of our sort of cohort guns, I think, you bump into people in corporate environments, and something something is dropped, suggesting a familiarity with aircraft or the Air Force, and you sort of look at each other, and it's like one of these love stories. You sort of recognize each other across a crowded room, and
Right.
I think we all grew up. If you grew up, listening to aviators in your parents' living room, it's very hard not to be fascinated. I was actually in a at a dinner last night. If I can ramble a little, I was at a dinner last night where there were 4 veterans of 4 Squadron present, and hearing them talk about 4 Squadron in its MiG-21 days, deploying to the northeast for firing exercises, and in the days when anti-malaria precautions weren't as good as they are now. It was fascinating, and I'm still, I'm past 50 now, and it was still fascinating. So
Yeah. Lovely. So what got you thinking of, undertaking the strenuous work of researching and then writing the book?
Well, I think, Guns, the answer to that, it's sort of an evolved answer. I don't know that this was what was in my mind at the time, but like you, like many of our of our contemporaries, I went overseas, for extended periods of time, from the age of from my early 20s onwards, right? And I sort of discovered that. In every other country that I was going to, mainly English-speaking countries, Commonwealth countries, many with a history of colonization by the UK. In every one of those countries, the Second World War was treated as a defining element of those countries' experiences. I mean, I've lived and worked in the UK itself. I've lived and worked in Jamaica. I've lived and worked in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Kenya, and in every one of those countries, the Second World War experience is a very important part of their journey to nationhood and self-definition. Now, in India, it's not, and I think the reason for that, and this has been said by people like Raghu Karnat, much more in a much more articulate way than I can. But the reason is that India became independent so soon after the Second World War that our national leader, our first generation of national leaders, in their anxiety to create a national narrative that everyone could buy into, sort of tried to create a narrative of India united in struggling for independence. And that didn't really square very well with the fact that more than 2.5 million of us had served in uniform. And that was at a time when India's population was about a quarter what it is now, right? So 2.5 million at that time is probably the equivalent of 1 crore today. So, in terms of the proportion of the population. So anyway, so I started bumping into I started bumping into Second World War museums in small towns in many of these countries. In small towns there are small Second World War museums, and I used to go and look them up whenever I could. And your father and my father could have set up a museum of about the same scale just from the contents of their old trunks. Yeah? I mean, those museums had on
Mm.
display, pay books and ID cards and, uniform badges
Uniforms
and
and
uniforms, badges, caps, and
right,
all that. Your father and my father could
right,
have put up a
right,
museum like that at the drop of a hat. And
right.
I was also subject to, at the time when I was growing up, certainly. Um, there were a lot of British books still in the school libraries and in the English speaking in the English sections of libraries. So I read a lot of Biggles and similar books growing up, and I found them so easily identifiable with in so many ways. So I did a lot. So a lot of my reading started with stuff like Biggles, and of course, a professional historian will tell you that those are terrible starts because they're full of colonial tropes and closet racism and stuff like that. And that may well be true, but it also, those books did. They did inculcate a certain basic understanding of the great movements of the Second World War in the boys who read them, and I think I wasn't immune to to all that. So I came away from there, wishing that there was someone would do something like that for showing Indian characters, because I knew by that time, most of my father himself, my father and father-in-law themselves were just too young to have by a few years to have served in World War II. They were commissioned in 50 and 51, right? But their immediate bosses in nearly every case, their immediate bosses wore the same four medal ribbons: the 1939 to 45 star, the Burma star, the same four ribbons that anyone who'd served in World War II actively was wearing.
Right,
Right?
right.
So I
Mm.
knew that there were dozens of them, and I knew that some of them had interesting adventures. They'd bailed out behind enemy lines and trekked back, through the jungles and stuff. And they had wonderful stories to tell, and I just couldn't understand why our stories weren't better known. And and then, I think it's fair to say, somewhere along that way, being a sort of, reader of Second World War books and histories almost in secret, I started bumping into people like Jagan Pillari Shetty, whom you know, who set up the the Bharat Rakshak website, and those were wonderful ways to connect with other people and who were interested, and I think in many ways it was Jagan's work that in collecting and publishing information about the Indian Air Force, particularly his first book on the 1965 war,
65,
which
right.
really, I mean, there were so many names in that book that I was familiar with, whom I'd addressed as uncle when I was a kid, right? So it just and he sort of prompted me to continue. He introduced me to the vast archive of original sources that are available in the UK through their national archives and what was then called their public records office and the national archives and other records. And as I've said to you, as I've said to many people in the past, the operations record books of all the pre-independent squadrons of the Indian Air Force are available in their entirety at the UK National Archives up to 26 January 1950. That was the date when they stopped assuming responsibility for maintaining copies of those documents. And those documents are very easy to access. At the time that Jagan and I went after them, you had to pay for them, right? And you had to pay in pounds, and it was pretty expensive to get the ORB of a full squadron. But between Jagan and myself and a couple of other enthusiasts, we mustered up the ORBs of the first few units, and those were like a god's eye view of what the Indian Air Force was doing in those years. And I think that relatively easy access was a part of what made it possible for me to research that period. And then, of course, many of us, I basically chased down anyone who had a Second World War. From the age of about 25 or 28 onwards, I think I made it a little more um, systematic. I was always interested in veteran stories, but from that age onwards, I started to actually chase down people with a Second World War experience and ask them if they'd be willing to talk, and most of them were very willing to talk. So, as one of the reviewers of my book said, it's a combination of unit diaries and oral histories. So, the unit diaries come from the operations record books, and the oral histories come from the many generous veterans who gave me time and insights and were happy to just ramble on about their experiences.
Fascinating, fascinating. Wow. How long did it take you? I mean, so this is almost sounds like, like a life's work for you. Is that right?
I think in some ways it is. I mean, I've been doing it. I've sort of been doing it relatively seriously for probably about 20 years, right?
Wow.
And in the sense that I have been, I've taken what's available. I've accepted help from Jagan and others, and now Anchit Gupta has become a very very useful resource. And there have always been others, people like Kapil Chandani and Anandeep Pannu and people like that. They've all got, there are, scattered around this circle of Indian aviation enthusiasts. There's a huge number of people who've collected material and are usually very, very generous about sharing what they've collected.
Visual to before visualizing. Just need 70, like your report type southeast, connection, for some midways, and you selected.
So take us back to, the earliest seeds of military aviation in the subcontinent, and how did that begin? How were those, who were those initial people? Where did they train? What were their experiences?
Yeah, well, as from my book Guns, the first, the first squadron, the first military aviation unit to operate in what's now India was 31 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, which their squadron motto is actually it's in Latin, but it translates as "First in Indian Skies." So to this date, they came out to India in 1916, and they didn't leave India till after independence. So till independence. So So they spent, their formative years were very much spent in India. But in those days, I think, they were formed during the First World War, and they continued to serve in India through most of the First World War, although there wasn't a large demand in India. Then, after the First World War ended, the Royal Air Force, as you know, came into being by the amalgamation of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service in April 1918, right? And then in November 1918, the First World War came to an end, right? Now, there was a genuine risk. I mean, the years immediately following the First World War, there was a sense, the League of Nations had just been formed, and there was a belief that the First World War had been the war to end all wars, which sounds very ironic now, but that was a genuine belief at that time. So powerful countries around the world started to run down their armed forces, just as happened in Europe immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Countries which had significant armed forces started running them down to a fraction of their earlier size. Now, why that's relevant to India in particular is the Royal Air Force, which was at the end of the First World War, was not even a year old. The Royal Air Force was being run down very, very rapidly. But then Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Hugh Trenchard, who is the sort of the regarded as the father of the RAF, he was basically looking around for work for the Air Force to do. And he lighted on this idea of imperial air policing. He was convinced that a few aircraft dropping bombs or strafing, these obdurate tribals was a quicker way to impose imperial fiat on the colonies than deploying the British Army, which had been the instrument of imperial fiat up to that point in time. So he was constantly pushing he was looking for roles for the Air Force, and he came up with this idea of using them in the colonies, and put forward lots of papers proving or attempting to prove that it would be cheaper to suppress rebellions in the far-flung, unruly parts of the empire by air rather than by deploying ground forces. And as it happens, one of the areas where that experiment was being tried out was the northwest frontier province of what was then undivided India. Right? So the northwest frontier province of India was very much a proving ground for the Royal Air Force in the period between the two world wars. And if not for the northwest frontier province of India, as well as a few other unruly tribal areas, Iraq and other parts of the world like that, the Royal Air Force might not have continued in the form it did between the two world wars. So India was actually very important historically to the maintenance of an air force and its use for certain ground support operations. Um, and the in some ways I think um, the ground was very ripe in India for India to become one of the earlier colonial powers in which to establish an air force. Then we owe a lot. The formation of the Indian Air Force owes a lot to this figure who was actually the chief of the Imperial General Staff, effectively and was at one time the head of the British Army in India. Or the British military footprint in India always included a formation called the Indian Army, even before independence, as you know. And so this particular figure I'm speaking about is General Andrew Skene. Andrew Skene had been the head of the Indian Army in India, the Raj era Indian Army, and went on to become a chief of the Imperial General Staff. But he was in India at the time of the Chelmsford reforms and other reforms in India, which were coming about as a result of agitation by Indian political parties during the British Raj for greater representation of Indians in government. Right? And as part of that, they were agitating for greater representation of Indians among the officers of the armed forces in India. So, one of the reports that, and Sir Andrew Skene was on this committee. It was called the Scheme Committee, which was chaired by himself. And interestingly, it included Motilal Nehru, the father of Jawaharlal, as well as Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because that committee included a number of what were regarded as educated and and influential Indians, as well as a number of British civil servants and similar figures. And that committee they not only made recommendations for Indians to be admitted to the British Military Academy at Sandhurst, the School of Artillery at Woolwich, and also the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell. So they made those recommendations, and interestingly, they also acceded to an idea of forming an Indian Air Force which would be entirely manned by Indians. The Indian Army was never intended to be entirely manned by Indians. In the Scheme Committee reports, there are stray phrases suggesting that they will cap it at 50% officers. They will cap Indianization of the officer levels at 50%. So they were imagining an Indian army in which 50% of the officers were Indian, 50% British, and most of the troops were Indian. They later on brought in this convention of always having one British one British battalion and two Indian battalions in every brigade, but it was still a partly British and partly Indian force. Whereas the Indian Air Force, right from the beginning, from the passage of the Indian Air Force Act in 1932, was to be an all-Indian arm. And I don't know what in Sir Andrew Skeen's mind prompted that, but I think we do have the Skeen Committee's report and Sir Andrew Skeen to thank for that. And it's I'm still sort of trying to research Sir Andrew Skeen in a bit more detail, because if you read the Skeen report, it's actually an incredibly liberal and forward-looking document. Now, Sir Andrew Skeen was a British general, right? So I'm imagining him as a crusty old figure, right? But the committee that he chaired has come up with this remarkably liberal document which talks about the responsibilities of the British to develop the technical and organizational capabilities of the Indians under their command until they're ready to take over from them. And there are incredibly liberal sentiments in the correspondence and in the Act. So in 1932, that all the Act was passed, and in 1933, well, even before then, around 1930-31, the body called the Federal Public Service Commission, which is the predecessor to the Union Public Service Commission of post-independence India, they had conducted entrance examinations for young Indians to go to Sandhurst, Woolwich, and Cranwell. And the first batch of 18 included 6 people going to Cranwell, and those are the famous first 6 of the Indian Air Force, who include Subrata Mukherjee, the 2 cousins, A Singh and B Singh, the Tich Tandon, who didn't quite qualify to become a pilot but was commissioned in the logistics branch, Sarkar, and the first 5 pilots and the first ground duties officer of the Indian Air Force were selected as a result, and in parallel with the passage of the Indian Air Force Act. And they came back to India after commissioning their course at Cranwell with reasonable distinction. They came back to India and formed the nucleus of Number 1 Squadron Indian Air Force with 2 British officers with a British officer in command and a second British officer as his deputy. And that British officer was the first commanding officer of A Flight Number 1 Squadron was then Flight Lieutenant Sir Cecil Bushier. Well, at that time United, so Flight Lieutenant Cecil Bushier, who went on to Air Vice Marshal rank and to very key positions in the Royal Air Force during World War II. He commanded one of the prominent Battle of Britain stations and so on. Yeah, go on.
Now, Sree, before this, there were Indians who had flown in the RAF itself, isn't it? I'm remembering Errol Sen and Indralal Roy, people like that.
Absolutely, I
So there was some history of Indians in flying roles. And
indeed.
can you tell us something about those?
Of course, yeah, that happened. Those mostly happened during the First World War, and I think India, India was actually more fortunate. Although it's fashionable to sort of, to sort of blame the British for a lot. India was actually more fortunate than many other colonies in the sense that there was a certain passage of bright young Indians to British educational institutions, right from the late 19th century onwards. And at the outbreak of the First World War, there were several Indians studying in prominent British universities, where many batches of students from those British universities volunteered to a man to go and serve in and so and in some of those batches there were indeed some adventurous young Indians who volunteered. The first of whom was Hardeep Singh Malik, and Hardeep Singh Malik is a particularly interesting case because he, at this time, of course, the Indian Air Force Act, which I was talking about earlier, hadn't been passed, hadn't even been thought of, right? But so he had to volunteer with his colleagues for the British force, and the British at that time said, "We can't take you in because you're." To put it in racial terms, they said, you're a university student, so you're probably coming for the for officer level admission, and we cannot take in someone who's not white for into the officer rank. We had no problem taking white the citizens of the or white of the dominions and the other and of the colonies where there was a substantial white population. But Hardeep Singh Malik was denied the opportunity, so he actually went and joined the French ambulance corps and was very, very close to being accepted into the French Air Corps when his old tutor, who was a batchmate of the British general, who was the head of recruitment in the Royal Flying Corps. His old tutor interceded on his behalf and got him, into the Royal Flying Corps. So he was the first of about 6 or 7 Indians who made it into the Royal Flying Corps. And that is like 18 or 19 years before the Indian Air Force Act was passed. And indeed, their the distinguished service of those 6 or 7 Indians who made it into the Royal Flying Corps was a very large part of the justification for the Air Force Act and for the setting up of the scheme commission itself, and then for the passage of the Air Force Act back in India. So yes, there were Indians who served in the Royal Flying Corps. One of whom, Indralal Roy, received a DFC, and he received his DFC and had shot down 9 German aircraft before he was 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
So, so,
Amazing.
so that's Indralal Roy's. That's the sort of the one-line Indralal Roy story. But there were about 6 or 7 Indians who in the RFC, 4 of whom actually flew in combat in the Western Front. So and they definitely, just the fact that they did, the fact that they qualified, the fact that they flew with distinction and absolutely no sign of cowardice or anything of that nature, all of that played a major role in the institutional acceptance of the idea of an Indian Air Force and the passage of the Indian Air Force Act.
Got it. Okay, and so fast forward to 32, 33, we were formed the first squadron in Karachi, I think, Drigg
Correct.
Road, and
Brig
then
Road, Karachi. Yeah,
there were these 5 pilots and 1 ground duties officer, I think.
correct.
And what were they flying, and what were the sorts of missions? How did they
Yeah.
perform?
Well, they started out flying the Westland Wapiti, a very robust, general purpose two-seater aircraft, which Jagan has written the definitive book about the Westland Wapiti in Indian Air Force service. And the so number one squadron of the Indian Air Force started out flying the Westland Wapiti and continued to fly it for about 6 or 7 years. And indeed, the Indian Air Force was stuck at one squadron for about 6 or 7 years, and they were based at Karachi, but they kept deploying to the Northwest Frontier Province, and in it took them about 2 years before they had to face an awful lot of prejudice, and there's no getting away from that. I mean, if you read the, it's actually in, it's actually there are some horror stories that are independently told in. Of the one of those first five pilots was Azad Baksh Awan, who migrated to Pakistan after partition, but was one of the first five Indians in the infant Indian Air Force. And Awan has left a memoir. It's a little rambling. His memoir is a little rambling. It's not divided into chapters by period or by year or anything like that. But it's a fascinating, sort of um, glimpse into the period of that time. Now, why I'm bringing that up is Awad's memoirs, as well as the memoirs of Sir Cecil Busher, Cecil Busher has written a memoir, and a couple of other British memoirs. They all confirm that there was some very serious challenges which you can only describe as racism, which those pioneers had to undergo. I mean, there were constant petty, they were subjected to constant petty humiliations and deprivations. They weren't given the same kind of uniform as their contemporaries. They were never allowed to command British ground crew, or to give orders to British ground crew. They initially flew, when they started flying in formation with British aircraft. They had to carry streamers to mark that these are aircraft being flown by Indians, so that the British could keep a safe distance, so that pilots could keep this. I mean, there was, it's hard to imagine some of what they had to go through. And for the first 2 years that they were flying, they weren't allowed to actually undertake combat missions. They were doing communications duties, message pickup and dropping, and they actually had to fight to be first allowed to go into combat. And that didn't happen till they'd been flying for a few years. And then, around the mid 30s, the 1930s or so, they finally, 1935 or so, they finally got into action in the Northwest Frontier Province. Now, that itself is, from many, colonial history points of view, and an interesting situation they're in, because they were strafing and dropping bombs on fellow Indians, right? And although from the frontier provinces, but they were, and there are a lot of stories, including Rudyard Kipling stories and poems, which speak about, which talk about unspeakable horrors that the tribesmen of the frontier province inflicted on British subjects, on British military personnel whom they managed to capture. But in fact, the it's actually very hard to find documented stories of such atrocities with names and dates for the Air Force. I mean, and there were slaughters, no question. There were cases when British military units were slaughtered to the last man in fighting. But when aircrew were forced down in the frontier province, even in what were marked as hostile territories, they were quite often returned to British posts. And of course, they were returned by tribes who expected a ransom for those returns. But I've been able to find a few stories of aircrew being returned, even if for a ransom, and I haven't been able to find a documented story with names and dates uh, of aircrew being, sort of butchered, as a lot of the Kiplinesque stories sometimes say. So it's a very interesting. So it's an under researched and story, something that could still benefit from being seriously researched. And I'd like to think that the Indians who flew in those Northwest Frontier Province missions, that they actually tried to develop a more humane way of carrying out that imperial air policing than the British did. They were definitely successful. They were definitely successful in pacifying villages, and I'd like to think that there was an element of um, um, there was something about about their Indianness which helped them to accomplish that pacification more effectively than a purely colonial force might have been able to. It may be fanciful, but
Got
it's
it.
a
Got
nice little. It's a thought that I've been developing in recent
it. Right.
years. So yeah, so that continued till the late 1930s, and then in the late 1930s, some far-seeing people, at the highest political levels in both India and the UK and elsewhere, could see that a major war was brewing, and that was the spur to start number two and number three squadrons of the Indian Air Force.
Individual shoot before visualizing. Just need 70, like your report type southeast, connection, for some midway, and you'll select it.
Just give me a sense for how civil aviation was growing at this time. I know JRD Tata had flown that first flight from, what was it, Karachi to Bombay, I think in the early 30s. And so was there a parallel growth in civil aviation in India?
There was indeed, and JRD Tata was only in his early 30s, at that time. But JRD Tata would have been a 32 year old pioneering civil aviation in India at the same time that Aspi engineer would have been a 22-year-old, with the second batch of Indians at Cranwell. He was, in fact, the only member of that batch. So again, you have to assume that Aspi engineer and JRD Tata knew each other. Right? They were both Parsis from a tiny community. So no one can tell me whether they actually met each other and spoke to each other. I find it hard to imagine that they didn't know each other in some way. And so yes, I mean, civil aviation was developing at the same time, and I think that was a good thing because it created an ecosystem of aviation in India. Going back a little again, you're probably aware that the first practical demonstration of airmail in India was actually of the first practical demonstration of airmail was actually in India when a single airmail flight was carried out between two towns in UP. I can't remember now which, by a French pilot. Right? And the company which had done that, which pulled that off, they actually did it in India before they did the first demonstration in the UK. And then in the UK, they actually, it kicked off on a commercial scale, which they were able to continue. But the point is, I think that civil applications were being thought of in India, quite early, and there was a civil aviation sector, smallish but robust, that was growing in parallel with the struggles that Number One Squadron Indian Air Force was having to prove itself. So it wasn't they weren't in isolation.
Got it. Okay. So tell me about the expansion. So there were squadrons, and then there was also this volunteer reserve and the coastal defense fights, isn't it?
Correct. So, early the Indian Air Force took 7 years to grow from one squadron to. It was 7 years old before Number One Squadron had been operating for 7 years before Number Two and Number Three squadrons were approved, right? And they had only just, I think, become completely Indianized themselves. After that, after it took them about 5 or 6 years before they got their first, before Subrata Mukherjee became the first flight commander in Number One Squadron, and then a year or two later he became the squadron commander, and then shortly afterwards, Aspi and Jambu Majumdar also took command of the squadron. And in the meantime, Number Two and Number Three squadrons were formed. Number Two and Number Three squadron were formed largely by taking about half a dozen officers from Number One squadron. So Number Two,
And in terms of equipment, had they upgraded from the Wapiti? Were they flying something more
they'd
modern?
started flying the Hawker Hart, which is still a biplane, but a significantly more modern aircraft, by about 1940. Right? And so by about 1940, 1939, 1940, they were flying. They were actually flying the Audax, which, as you know, is a variant of the Hart, which just has an exhaust pipe which goes down past the pilot rather than the fishtail exhausts in front of the pilot. So because of that, they were able to fly at night, although they had no other night flying aids. They didn't have the fisheye exhausts in the front in forward of the pilot, which would the exhaust would have blinded the pilots for night flying otherwise. Right? So, so still a biplane, but a more modern biplane. And you can sort of you look at an audax or a heart with an imaginative eye, and you can see the lines that are going to become the Hurricane. It is a Hawker design, and you can see the lines that are going to become the Hurricane. So yeah, so 7 years before numbers 2 and 3 squadrons were formed, and at the same time that numbers 2 and 3 squadrons were being formed, roughly, the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve was formed, which is basically an attempt to mobilize the civil aviation sector and find young pilots, young Indian pilots from the civil aviation sector who could be trained relatively quickly in the nuances of military aviation. And the fourth, I mean, the first pilots course trained in India had been selected just I think there had been there were about 20 or 30 Indians who'd been sent to Cranwell over that 7 year period. Not all of whom completed the course, not all of whom came back able to take up the roles as pilots and officers in the Indian Air Force. But it was fairly clear that that was not a scalable model to expand the Indian Air Force. So they started a training school in India, in fact, the first time that they trained, the first time that they tried to train a selected batch of Indians, what you might call number one pilots course of the Indian Air Force, they actually were sent off to somewhere in Egypt to do their flying training. They were recruited in India, subject to some initial pre-flying training in India, and then sent off to Egypt to do their actual flight training. By the time of fourth pilot's course, the concept of the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve had been sort of formalized, and people who had the equivalent of a CPL, people who had a C license in those days, which is roughly the equivalent of a CPL today, were offered instant commission into the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve, and that was still a very prestigious sort of be offered in those days. So there was a fair number of volunteers, and these were all people who'd been flying aircraft for Indian industrial houses, or been flying as hobby flyers in some cases, and they were taken on board and formed into the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve, which also included a number of Britons who were resident in India, but were generally quite these were families that had sometimes been living in India for several generations, and so they were Indian in everything, in many ways, and they formed the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve. 24 of whom were sent off to the UK in mid 1940 to train, to go through the same training round that the Volunteer Reserve and that the pilots of some of the European countries that had been overrun by Nazi Germany at that time were all going through. There was a sort of abbreviated program of training for people who were already qualified pilots or had flown for, the Polish Air Arm, or the air arms of one of those countries that the Nazis had overrun in the first couple of years of the war. These 24 Indians were put through that same program. They actually trained alongside Polish pilots at 56 OTU in the UK. Those of them who completed the course successfully went on to serve with Royal Air Force squadrons, and about 16 of them served with Royal Air Force fighter and bomber squadrons. One of those who served with RAF bomber squadrons was Shivdev Singh, who later came back to India and became vice chief of the Indian Air Force. Another was one who served with fighter squadrons of the RAF was Mahendra Singh Pooji, whom I actually had the opportunity to go and meet in the UK
Fascinating. Wow.
in the early 2000s. And he was a DFC recipient and went back to the UK after the Second World War and had served with a couple of RAF fighter squadrons before he came back to India. Then spent 20 or 30 years serving in India, then migrated back to the UK and was living in the UK and was still alive till about 2 or 3 years ago. He passed away only about 3 years ago. So I managed to meet him. He was very generous with his photographs, his logbooks. He trusted me to take all his photographs to India to have them scanned and bring them back to him. So that was a real sign of trust, I guess.
Amazing.
And,
And he flew the Hurricane, I
he
think,
flew the
right?
Hurricane mostly, and most of the Indians at that time were confined to Hurricane units. Very few of them were trusted with Spitfires, and the Spitfire didn't come to India till relatively late in the war. But even the Indians who were serving in the UK at that stage mostly flew Hurricanes. Then Air Chief Marshal Latif was also sent to the UK as a young pilot officer a couple of years later, around 1944. And he trained on Spitfires in the UK. But he also came back to India and was assigned to a Hurricane squadron in the Indian Air Force. So,
Great. So, fast forward to 42, 43, war is raging in North Africa, Europe, but here it was relatively quiet. The Japanese, had they attacked Burma yet? And tell us about when the Indian Air Force or the Royal Indian Air Force first kind of went into combat against a major power.
sure. So in 1939, the Second World War started effectively in September 1939. But 1939, 40, and the first 11 months of 1941 were relatively quiet in India itself. Right? There was no fighting in India. In fact, the British were more nervous about the Soviet Union being close to northwestern India than about Axis powers. Now, all that changed on the 7th of December 1941 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in the Pacific. On the same day that I mean, everyone remembers, or most World War II historians remember Pearl Harbor, but actually at the same time that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked a number of British possessions in Southeast Asia, and the war very rapidly came from through Southeast Asia up to Burma and up to the very and up to Burma and in and by the end of end of I mean literally within weeks the Japanese were knocking on the border of Burma and coming up the long southern tail of Burma called which is that time was called Tenasserim and number one squadron, which up to that point in time had been agitating for to participate more directly in the war, finally got permission to go to Burma. This at this time they had just converted to the Westland Lysander, which is also a two-seater aircraft, and it is an army cooperation aircraft, not a combat aircraft in the conventional sense. But they grabbed the opportunity and they took it and they came out to Burma. And they came out to Burma in about February of 1942. Now,
Okay, so about the time of the fall of Singapore.
yes, almost exactly the same time, and they took about 2 weeks. They actually had to ferry their own aircraft all the way from Karachi to Burma themselves, right? So that itself in those days was quite an epic ferry, and it took about 10 days or 2 weeks or so. I have the exact dates. I actually have pages from Jambu Majumdar's logbook which document that ferry, and it's a and they spent about 3 or 4 weeks in active combat in Burma during that first Burma campaign. Now, that first Burma campaign was a complete disaster for the British. They had to keep falling back, and from the eastern border of Burma, they were pushed almost all the way back to the western border of Burma, and so the Indian Air Force role there only lasted about 3 or 4 weeks. But even in that 3 or 4 weeks, they distinguished themselves very, very effectively. The day they arrived at Taungoo, the base where they were initially placed in Burma, the day they arrived, they were bombed by Japanese bombers, and but which it was sort of they arrived on the same day as an RAF squadron, and the experience shook up both sides, both the RAF and the newly arrived squadrons. But Jumbo Majumdar, who was then the commanding officer of Number One Squadron, he was determined not to let that define the experience. And the very next day, he took a single Lysander with with all of 250-pound bombs and went to attack the Japanese base from which the raid on them had originated. It was just over the border in Thailand, in that actually, but he actually went and attacked. He actually went and bombed a Japanese Air Force airfield in Thailand with a Lysander. That's almost incredible. But it really fired up the squadron, right? And the squadron from that point onwards, um, you know. Uh, they saw themselves as a bomber squadron, as the equivalent of as good as anybody else, and went right into action. In doing bombing the Japanese and Japanese airfields and bases and army, wherever they could be identified. And it's quite a story. And and being able to maintain that positive spirit when everything around them was collapsing is a real tribute to them and to their leadership. That was a It was a remarkable story of success. Sadly, they couldn't by themselves turn the tide, and by the end of February, early March, they had to withdraw back to India, which is also quite an epic story. But it actually has been acknowledged again. Much as it's sort of fashionable to say the British never acknowledged what we did. If you actually look at the official report of the Air Officer commanding Burma back to the Air Ministry in London on the first Burma campaign, he actually does have very good things to say about Number One Squadron and how effective they were in the short time that they were part of the battle. But it was a sort of um, successful. It was a very effective participation, but in a losing cause, and the Allies had to abandon Burma within a few weeks of Number One Squadron getting there. So I think that sort of it probably successful participation in a losing campaign doesn't make for as good a story as it should. So although Jumbo was decorated with the DFC and for his leadership. So
And there was a fairly lengthy period of kind of
consolidation and separation.
battle of
Yes.
attrition, consolidation before General Slim launched the attack again. And of course, Kohima happened. So, what was the Air Force doing during
Yeah,
that time?
well, by the time of, as you say, General Slim sort of reorganized 14th Army to take the offensive and go back into Burma. That took till late 1943. Then in late 1943, when the 14th Army under General Slim was launched back into Burma, to go back into Burma, by that time there were about numbers four, five, not five, numbers four, six, seven, and eight squadrons of the Indian Air Force had all been formed. We didn't form a five squadron Indian Air Force at that time because five squadron RAF was also in India, and it was felt that there might have been confusion. There was a five squadron IAF also raised. So four, six, seven, and eight squadrons were all raised around 1942. And by the time Slim launched 14th Army into the first Arakan campaign, um, there, by that time there were about 30 or 40 Allied combat squadrons and a huge number of Allied transport units flying or ready to participate in the war. But from the first Arakan in the first Arakan campaign, four squadron of the IAF was flying in support of the Arakan campaign. By the time of the second Arakan campaign, there were two Indian Air Force squadrons flying on the Arakan front, and there were four Indian Air Force squadrons flying on the northern front, which is, or the central front, which is where Imphal and Kohima took place. So from that point on, there were never less than four or five, and up to about seven or eight Indian Air Force squadrons participating in the war.
Visual to before visualizing. Just need 7D, like your report time southeast, connection, for some midway, and you will still like this.
And in those years, 42, 43, we also did a lot of airlifting to support the Chinese. Did we participate in that, as in the RIAF or some of these folks we're talking about, or was that done by other forces?
No, we did indeed. In fact, even number one squadron in the first Burma campaign, which is as tiny a force as it was, 12 or 13 Lysanders, they actually were split up into three different operating formations, and one of them was actually specifically assigned to operate from northern Burma in support of the Chinese army, which at that time had been fighting Japan for the Chinese army at that point in time had been fighting Japan for about 7 years. So, at the time, a lot of the Allied reports, especially the American reports, they were very dismissive of the Chinese contribution. But I think in recent years, there's been a lot of reassessment of the Chinese military contribution, and it's acknowledged that the Chinese put up some very strong resistance against the Japanese. And certainly in that period of February and March 1942, um, about three or four Indian Air Force Lysanders were supporting the Chinese army so effectively, in fact, that Chiang Kai shek, the generalissimo of nationalist China at that time, he actually asked to meet with Jumbo. And the some of the memoirs from that time say that he offered that Jumbo, who had been feeling not adequately supported and recognized by the British government, was seriously tempted to join Chiang Kai-shek's forces on terms similar to those on which the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, was flying in support of Chinese forces.
Hmm. Got it, got it. And did we support the long range groups like the Chindits and things like
We
that? Did we
did.
do anything there?
We did indeed. I mentioned that four squadron participated in the first Arakan campaign. They were effectively flying in support of the first Chindit expedition. Now they weren't. A lot of the early accounts of the first Chindit expedition don't mention the Indian support, and I this is just me speculating. I think it's known that Wingate did not particularly want Indian troops as part of his Chindit expeditions. And the reason he gave was that Indian troops had very complex dietary requirements, and it was logistically just too difficult under the conditions that Chindits operated.
They had to live off the
Yes,
ground.
it was logistically too difficult to cater to those complex requirements. So he accepted Gurkhas, but no other Indian troops. So there were no Indian troops in his first Chindit expedition, and it's possible that the fact that that four squadron of the Indian Air Force was flying in support of them was not necessarily made public to General Wingate. Wingate was treated as a bit of a loose cannon by some Allied generals, and they they acknowledged his successes, but they didn't always tell him everything about what was going on behind the scenes. So I think it's possible that at the time, not much was made of the Indian support, or the Indian Air Force support to the first Chindit expedition. But by the time of the second Chindit expedition, it was much more it was much clearer, and there was I think it was 9 squadron of the Indian Air Force which spent extended periods actually explicitly supporting the second Chindit. By that time, of course, Wingate himself was dead. He'd been killed in an air crash. So I think that sensitivity was removed. So
So, how about the Battle of Kohima has been regarded as one of Britain's greatest
indeed,
battles, and what was the Air Force component to that, and did our Indian Air Force participate?
very much so. I mean, between Imphal and Kohima, there were two Indian Air Force Hurricane squadrons, and two Indian Air Force squadrons flying the Vultee Vengeance dive bomber, which participated in those battles. And the first and the longest serving of the Indian Air Force squadrons, which went to Imphal, was in fact number one squadron again of the Indian Air Force, by this time commanded by Arjun Singh, no less. So number one squadron
Okay.
went to Imphal, commanded by Arjun Singh, and they spent 14 months in on that deployment. That is an extraordinarily long time. Most combat squadrons, RAF and Indian Air Force, most combat squadrons served in that theater would serve in a frontline location for 3 to 6 months, and then they'd rotate back for replenishment, sometimes for upgrade of the equipment to a newer variant of the aircraft and things like that. But number one squadron of the Indian Air Force spent 14 months on that deployment, and it came back with multiple DFCs, including one to Arjun Singh himself. So lots of Indian Air Force support and involvement, tiny as it was, tiny as Air Force was. So,
Right. And, and you were talking about equipment. So, what were they flying by this time? Had they begun to get something more modern? And
I think, well, they'd moved on from Lysanders, definitely, but through most of the Second World War, by the end of the Second World War, the Indian Air Force was up to 9 squadrons, right? Now, 8 of those 9 squadrons flew the Hurricane at some point or other. Two of them flew. Two of them flew Vengeances, of course, before and the two squadrons that flew Vengeances, which are number 7 and number 8 squadrons, they flew Vengeance. They each flew Vengeances for one tour, and then after their first tour on Vengeances, for their second tour onwards, 7 squadron converted to the Hurricane. 8 squadron became the first Indian Air Force squadron to become an all Spitfire squadron. Although number 4 squadron had operated one or two Spitfires, they'd had one or two Spitfires in their inventory, but they were not an all Spitfire squadron. So 8 squadron of the Indian Air Force was the first one to become an all Spitfire squadron. But again, I think it's probably fair to say that the only reason the Indian Air Force was given a Spitfire to play with was because RAF Spitfire squadrons were moving on to Thunderbolts. See, the Spitfire was not ideal for the work that the air forces were doing by this stage of the Burma campaign. By this stage of the Burma campaign, most of what what the Allied Air Force was doing was not dogfights. Right? The Spitfire was, of course, optimized for high altitude dogfights, where it was obviously beautifully designed for that role. But in Burma, the main task of the air forces was close air support. Right? So that was low level, sort of down and dirty, and needed aircraft that could carry a reasonable payload of ordnance to deliver. And the Spitfire was really not ideal for that role. But even so, I can tell you, and I've talked to a couple of 70 and 80-year-old Spitfire veterans of World War II. Their eyes still light up when they talk about the Spitfire.
yeah,
At the age of
it's like the
80, yeah,
MiG-21, I'm guessing.
absolutely, very much. At the age of 80, they still light up, their eyes still light up, and and they're willing to fight so anyone who who disrespects it. So, so yeah, so that's how we were. By the end of the war, we were eight Hurricane squadrons and one Spitfire squadron.
Now, tell me about transport fleet, the heavy bomber fleet. Did we have any of that?
We had no heavy bomber fleet in the Second World War. Some of the we didn't. I think I've been rambling and you've been letting me ramble guns, but so I didn't actually mention the coast defense flights. But around the time that the volunteer reserve was being set up, we also set up five, later six small units called the Coast Defense Flights. One of the Coast Defense Flights operated Blenheims. Okay? So those are twin-engine medium bombers. Although they weren't being used in a long-range bombing role, they were being used in a maritime reconnaissance and support role. So we did fly a handful of Blenheims in the during that period of the Second World War, but we never actually, and we flew Vengeances, which were dive bombers, but we never flew heavy bombers during the Second World War, which leads to an interesting post-war story about how we came to operate a Liberator, well, three Liberator squadrons. I don't know if we'll have the time for that, but that's strictly a post-World War II story. And but so we didn't operate heavy bombers. No, the first transport squadron was envisaged around mid 1945, and that is number 12 squadron, which actually only got raised just after the end of World War II. So number 12 squadron, which was the 10th Indian Air Force squadron in terms of sequence of raising. Number 12 squadron doesn't count as a Second World War squadron because it wasn't raised until just after the war was over. But that became our first dedicated transport squadron, and they did a lot of their conversion to the they did a lot of not they did a lot of their type training on Dakotas at the hands of 31 Squadron, which I mentioned as being the first military squadron to operate in India from 1916 onwards. So 31 Squadron was still in India at that time. They were flying Dakotas at that time, and they undertook some of the first conversions, including, I believe, Mehar Singh. Mehar Singh was converted to the Dakota by 31 Squadron. RAF, that is. So,
So all the later the stalwarts of the Indian Air Force like Arjun Singh, Subrata Mukherjee, Shivdev Singh, they were all seeing action during this time, I presume,
they were
right?
all World War II veterans with solid combat experience in World War II. And I think we talked about this last time, but the first three Indian Air Force chiefs after independence were British, but then from Subrata Mukherjee onwards, they were Indians. Now, those first few, Subrata Mukherjee, Aspi Engineer, Arjun Singh, PC Lal, all of them were World War II veterans. Right? And from that first batch of 24 who went to the UK, they produced something like 8 or 9 air marshals and air vice marshals out of a batch of 24. So those World War II veterans actually um, did populate the higher ranks of the Indian Air Force very effectively after independence. So, very much so.
Fascinating. So one character in your book who's kind of interesting came from the army to the air force, went back to the army, reappears in 1962, is Niranjan
That's
Prasad. So tell
Niranjan
us
Prasad.
something about
Yeah,
him. Yeah,
he is a controversial. I mean, historically, I think a controversial figure because, and he is at the time that we were expanding the air force, we invited army officers who were interested in flying to join, and with seniority preserved. And Niranjan Prasad was one of those who came. A few others did, and many of them went on to very distinguished service. Now, Niranjan Prasad Niranjan Prasad was a flight commander with Number One Squadron when they went to Burma as part of the first Burma campaign, flying Lysanders, and he, by all accounts, he did reasonably well. Now, there is a memoir by one other member of Number One Squadron from that period, who also went on to senior rank in the Air Force post independence. There is one such memoir which is very critical of Niranjan Prasad. But I have met and it basically says he was a very poor pilot. Right? But I have met and talked to 2 or 3 other Indian Air Force officers who served under Niranjan Prasad in 8th Squadron during World War II, and they swear by him. And it's not so much for reasons of his being the best pilot among them or anything like that, but because he was the best, because he did so much to inculcate a sense of unit pride and esprit de corps, right? And they swear by him, and these include people like Group Captain Phil Phillip, and Wing Commander Hoshan Patel. And these are all people who've been, who've served and fought shoulder to shoulder or wing to wing with Niranjan Prasad, and they swear by him. Right? Now, it is the reality. Well, and later in the war, later in his period of command of number 8 Squadron, he was commanding number 8 Squadron at that time. There was an unsavory incident when he got into a terrible row with the British um, uh, uh, ground liaison officer, who basically gave all the Indian Air Force close support squadrons at the time their instructions. Niranjan Prasad got into a severe disagreement with the ground liaison officer and with he had a British flight commander, which was a very, very difficult situation because at that point in time, um, the British were still not the British were completely unused to having an Indian commanding officer. So it's a lot of people have, including some people who were airmen at that time, um, some Britons and some Indians both, have confirmed that relations between the two flights were very bad because they'd actually segregated all the Indians into one flight and all the Europeans. Now, Europeans is a misnomer because they included Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans, but they were all white, right? So into the other flight, and so there was a disagreement when Niranjan Prasad was given a target which he refused to accept. Uh, and the version I've heard from the Indians is that the squadron had already carried out two raids that day. It was already dusk. Dusk sets in relatively early in those eastern. If you go by the Indian standard timing, dusk sets in relatively early. So it was dusk. They'd already flown two sorties. And it was justifiable for Niranjan to turn down the assignment. But
Target was very close to the forward line
target
of
was very
troops or
close
something
to
like
the
that.
to the forward line of troops, and he didn't want to do that in poor light. But he was blamed for he was it was officially reported as a case of lacking moral fiber, or being reluctant to attack because there might have been. Um, there was even a rumor put out that he was reluctant to attack because there might have been an Indian National Army unit there, which is probably rubbish because I don't think they were even. I don't think they were very visible to the to the British at that time, and they certainly weren't being used in forward positions. Indian and INA troops were not being used in forward positions, whatever their apologists may say. So it's a controversial story, but he was made to revert to the army, right? And then what we do know is that both he went in the army, he went on to command a brigade in 1962 and a division in 1965. And what we do know is that neither of those occasions did he emerge entirely with honor. His brigade was one of those that broke up in the 1962 attack, and his division. Well, not so much the division, but he came under fire and he had to abandon his jeep in the 1965 war. He was a little too far forward and had to abandon his jeep in a hurry. The Pakistanis captured his jeep, and they've never let us forget it. It's his jeep is on display in some museum in Pakistan. So yes, I mean, he's had a controversial career, but I'm not sure it's as black and white as either side makes out. I think it's a very, very
Got it,
story.
got it.
So, and I've tried to convey
Right,
that in
right.
my book. So.
Individuals who before visualizing. Just need 70, like your report type southeast, connection, for some midway, and you'll select it.
Okay, super. So, Sri, in the few minutes we have left, tell us about the post-war, pre-independence or early independence period, just the flowering of some of these, these legends that we've already heard of and their operational action. How do they rise to positions of leadership? And I've heard that given that there was a lot of British officers left at that time, there was a vacuum, and some of these folks occupied positions of responsibility very quickly. And I remember my father commanded Ambala, Arjun Singh got married when he was the station commander AOC of
Yes.
Ambala. You can imagine how young he
Oh
was
yeah.
at that time.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but just tell us about that period, post-war,
Yeah. Happy to.
and independence, early independence.
Yeah, very happy to do so. So at the end, when the war actually ended, India was the Indian Air Force was at 9 squadrons, with the 10th squadron forming, right? And but the British actually, what had happened with the British Armed Force at that time was, in the course of the war, the British had implemented a draft, right? And they had a very complex draft in which they drafted people into the armed forces on terms which were not permanent terms, which were wartime conditions only, and they'd worked out a formula for how quickly they'd be released from service once the war ended. Now, that the formula they'd worked out turned out to be almost unworkable, right, in practice. And so when the war ended, India was full of British and other Commonwealth military personnel, all of whom were desperate to go home, right, and couldn't wait to go home. But their release dates were very complicated, and that actually led to a couple of minor mutinies in Air Force units around the country. Now, it doesn't get as much publicity as the Indian Naval Mutiny of 1946, but there were definitely some scattered mutinies and in Air Force units around that time, and that was mainly because the British wanted to get out and go home as quickly as possible, and the arrangements for releasing them as quickly as possible were not in place. Now, in India, the situation for the Indians, the situation was different. By that time, it was obvious that the British were leaving fairly soon, and the Indian political leadership of that time wanted the Indian. I mean, every other armed force in the world at that time was probably keen to reduce in size now that the war was over. But India was on the threshold of independence and wanted to retain as many as it could of the people who'd been trained, because there were frankly not many Indians who'd been given administrative or technical training of the kind that the armed forces had dished out. So there were definitely opportunities for those who stayed. And in the immediate post-war, pre-independence years, there were a couple of interesting opportunities. For instance, Number 8 Squadron was actually in Rangoon at the time of the surrender. And they participated in some of the Number 8 Squadron of the Indian Air Force. That is, they were actually in Rangoon at the time of the end of the war, and they participated in some of the surrender ceremonies around there. Although no one, so that's actually been described quite vividly by Phil Phillip, who's one of the officers whose recollections I've used most in my book, and it's they're they actually took the surrender of a very, very senior Japanese general, and the Indian Air Force Spitfires of 8th Squadron escorted that Japanese general's aircraft as he came to do the
Wow.
to sign the surrender. So there was interesting stuff. And the Number 4 Squadron of the Indian Air Force, of course, became was a member of the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, which occupied Japan for 2 years after the end of the Second World War. So they spent more than a year about in actually based in Japan, actually based in a city in a town quite close to Nagasaki, which had been hit by an atom bomb. And they actually went and visited. I mean, in those days, I think there was, the effects of radiation, the long-term effects of radiation, exposure to radiation weren't understood. So a lot of a lot of the members of 4 Squadron actually went and visited, the city that had been devastated by a nuclear bomb, and apparently uh, top-end hotel accommodation was available for a song. Yeah, understandably. Or so I hear from the veterans of that squadron whom I've talked to, and and so yeah, they had opportunities along those lines. And another interesting feature is that suddenly Spitfires were available in vast quantities. Right? The British were abandoning. Yeah, Spitfires are lying out. So in the period immediately after the Second World War had ended, suddenly all our Hurricane squadrons had high Mark Spitfires to convert to Mark 14s and upwards.
How
So
nice.
they loved it. They were very happy to take over, Mark 14 and Mark 21 Spitfires and fly them. But then, of course, there was the disorganization posed by partition, and the Indian Air Force was uh, did a lot of impromptu refugee evacuation flights. I mean, initially their own personnel, because what had happened was around July 1947. What had happened was all Indian Air Force personnel forms were distributed all in Indian Air Force stations, asking personnel to choose between India and Pakistan, and sometime at stations that were in what was going to become Pakistan, there were still many people who'd opted for India. And sometimes it was necessary to send a Dakota there post haste to evacuate them. So,
Wow.
so there
Mhm.
were
How did we divide the squadrons up at the time of independence? How many did
effective,
we have, and how
yeah,
did we divide them up?
effectively, it was 6.5 squadrons to India and 3.5 to Pakistan. And there was supposed to have been a standstill agreement in place. In the early years, there was a lot of optimism about the possibility of working together. There was a suggestion that all Dakota maintenance would be carried out for both air forces in India, and all Tempest and Spitfire maintenance would be carried out for both air forces in Pakistan. So there were a lot of Tempest spares, and some of the equipment needed for maintenance were left behind at Pakistani air bases when the people who opted for India moved to India, and a lot of the Dakota spares were left in India. So in the first year or so, Harjinder Singh, who was the senior most technical officer of the Indian Air Force, he's recorded that he actually went across to Pakistan to pick up some spares and maintenance rigs, and he only got away with it because the Pakistani officer who was looking after the depot where they were stored was a former colleague, right? And otherwise, it was completely unofficial, and there was a standstill agreement in place. And we weren't supposed to transfer it from one side to the other. So both sides claim that they were hard done by in the deal, and but it's interesting that there were actually these plans to collaborate, and until the Pakistani forces became explicitly involved in the 1947-48 operations in Kashmir. There was a lot of optimism about being able to work together. I am told that the pay that the pay of Pakistani officers, of Pakistani Air Force officers, was still being calculated and worked out at our accounts offices till quite late after independence.
Oh, fascinating.
I mean, someone in the accounts
Uh,
branch really needs to write that history. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, okay. So, Sri, just want to tell the audience, the book is called The Forgotten Few: The Indian Air Force in World War II, published by Harper Collins, available on Amazon, on the Kindle.
Yeah.
There is an audiobook
There
also,
is
if
an
I remember
audiobook.
correctly.
There is an
Yeah.
audiobook also. There's an audio version.
Lovely book. So if you're interested in military aviation in the subcontinent, you've got to get this book. But you're working on something else that's about to be released, got delayed by a few weeks, I think. What's
That's
that
correct.
about?
I am indeed. It's been with the publishers, the same publishers, Harper Collins, for some time. This one is on the 1971 war, the Bangladesh Liberation War, and India's participation. And it's a little different. It's not that the Forgotten Few is an exhaustive history, but my book on the 1971 war, which the title, by the way, is December in Dhaka, and it's already on pre-order at Amazon and Flipkart, and it's, as I say, a story of the Indian participation in the 1971 war, but it's not as detailed an operational history as the Forgotten Few is, because I've actually tried to tell the operational history as well as some of the background to Bangladesh's desire to separate from Pakistan, and some accounts of the diplomatic battling that was going on at the same time in parallel with the war. And I've also interspersed it with little sections that I sort of have as sidebars or subheadings in the book, that I call the schoolboy view, because I was a schoolboy at that time, and I have schoolboy memories of. I was a 10-year-old at that time, and I have schoolboy memories of what was going on then. So I sometimes have, a schoolboy's memory of, for instance, the Boira dogfight, right? The banner headlines 2 days later. It didn't happen. The news didn't come out the same day or the next day. They didn't come out till 2 days later. So I sort of have a schoolboy reaction to that, followed by a reasonably, a slightly more, um, you know, adult story of how the Boira dogfight took place, and so on throughout the book. So it's a slightly selective, retelling of anecdotes. And I've also made a point, and this is something which I know, some of my friends in other countries will not appreciate. But I've made a point of saying that, we celebrate the military victory, and that's well and good. But I think one reason why the 71 war should be remembered is that it was much more than a military victory. It was a humanitarian victory. And there is a significant ethical and jurisprudence component to that war, which I think most of the histories that we brought out, particularly last year during the 50th anniversary year, have overlooked that element completely. And I'm sorry that that's been done. I think it needs to be covered better. And
Mm, very true, very true. So, I think it sounds like the book's going to add a very interesting dimension to that war, and I can't wait to get my hands on it and read it.
I hope so, Gans. And thank you for your,
Super.
very generous words about my last book. And I hope the next one also measures up to your expectations.
No, it's just, and I think I know the meticulous research that has gone behind it, and so I salute you for all of that effort to make sure that every word is backed up by historical record, and I think that's the only way to separate fact from fiction and to tell these stories in the correct way. So
Oh, yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Gans. Thank you so much. And yes,
Great. This has just been a wonderful conversation, Sree.
likewise,
Thank you
Gans.
so much for doing it.
Likewise. I always enjoy
And
talking to you. And
Individuals to before eventually. Just need 70, like your import IP Southeast, connection, for eventually, and you'll select it.
well, folks, that's all we have time for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chordia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal, and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.